Hey everyone, so on today's episode, we're going to be continuing and finalizing our Tiki 100 series. And today, we're going to be getting a little sticky because today's episode is all about syrups. We're going to go over the 7 essential syrups that you need when you start your own home tiki bar. Plus, we're going to make a cocktail that includes 2 of them and isn't rum-based. Because again, you guys have been asking for a lot more non-rum-based tiki cocktails. So today, we're going to go over these syrups, plus we're going to be making a Saturn. I'm Andy, this is Easy Tiki Drinks, so let's do this. So today is the final culmination of our Tiki 100 series, and we're going to be going over these syrups. Now, if you missed my other episodes, I'll make sure to link them up here, but essentially in Tiki 101, I went over the 5 essential rums that you're going to need. After that, we went over some modifiers. Finally, we went over the citrus that you're going to need, and now we're concluding everything with the syrups. Now, there is a video that I did leave out on this shoot plan, and that is basically glassware and garnish. And if that's a video that you think is important to the Tiki 100 series, definitely drop a comment below, let me know, and I will add it to the series. Anyway, before we get going with all of these different syrups that we're going to need for your home tiki bar, let's build a cocktail and sip on it so that I have something to drink while I talk about these, and I don't get too parched. So today we're going to be making a Saturn. Now the Saturn was originally created in 1967 by Jay Popo when he entered it into an actual cocktail competition. It won him the competition, and that's when it gained notoriety. Now, it is not a rum-based tiki cocktail. In fact, it is gin-based. Speaking of which, let's see what we're going to need to make our Saturn. To make our Saturn, we are going to need a London dry gin, a falernum, Passionfruit Syrup, Orjot, lemon juice, New Orleans bitters, and saline solution. Now, right off the bat, I know some of you guys are saying, Andy, the original Saturn doesn't include saline or bitters, and I agree, it does not. However, as you guys have noticed over the past couple videos, I've been adding saline and bitters to all of my cocktails. I find that they elevate the flavors if used correctly, and I don't think they subtract or really change the flavor profile and simply just enhance everything that I'm currently working with. So take these as my versions of these cocktails, if you will. Anyway, let's build the Saturn, we'll sip on it, and then I'll talk about the syrups that we're gonna need. In your shaking tin, add 5 drops of saline solution. Follow that up with 2 dashes of New Orleans bitters, 3/4 of an ounce or 22.5 milliliters of lemon juice. Follow that up with 1/4 of an ounce or 7.5 milliliters of Orjot, 1/4 of an ounce or 7.5 milliliters of falernum, then 1/2 ounce or 15 milliliters of Passionfruit Syrup. Finally, 2 ounces or 60 milliliters of a London dry gin. Add some pebble ice to your shaking tin. Give it a nice hard shake for about 5 to 8 seconds. Grab a pearl diver glass and open pour in. Top with more pebble ice. And garnish with a cocktail cherry skewered to a lemon wheel and a Surfside sip straw. So there you have it, my slight variation on the 1967 Saturn. Let's give it a try. For those of you that have never enjoyed a Saturn, you are really missing out. It's almost like a tiki version of a Tom Collins, which is basically an alcoholic lemonade. So how could you go wrong? Now, let's talk about a few of the choices that I made, and then we'll talk about the syrups. So first off, you know that I added saline solution and bitters to my cocktail. In fact, the New Orleans bitters that I'm using are the Bitter Truth Company's Creole bitters, and I find that these 2 ingredients are really gonna help to make the other flavors in this cocktail pop. Now, a lot of you may be asking, Andy, why didn't you use an aromatic bitters? So I went with the New Orleans bitters because I find that it pairs better with the gin than an aromatic bitter. Next up for my syrups in this, I'm actually using BJ Reynolds, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as I talk about the rest of these ingredients. But for my Orjot, I'm using BJ Reynolds Orjot, and for my Passionfruit Syrup, BJ Reynolds as well. For my falernum, now there's a lot of different options here. I'm going with the Bitter Truth Company's Golden Falernum. I really like the ginger note that it adds to this cocktail. For my gin, I chose a London dry gin, which is pretty standard, and it's what I would recommend to any of you out there. And I'm going with Haymans. I really like it. If you want to go a little bit more juniper with it, a Roku or a Japanese gin works really, really well as well. All right, so let's start talking about these syrups, right? First up, in our tiki arsenal, we are going to need Demerara Syrup. Now, before you start asking, Andy, what about simple syrup? And you're right, simple syrup does get called for in a lot of classic tiki cocktails. I pair simple syrup and Demerara syrup within the same category. They are a sugar syrup. One is made with white sugar, one is made with Demerara sugar. I am not a fan of just adding sugar to add sugar, so I typically stay away from using simple syrup. Now, with that said, the only place I do use simple syrup is in a daiquiri, which I don't make a ton of for myself, so I usually don't actually have it in my fridge. I keep Demerara instead. That Demerara syrup is going to add a bit of toffee and burnt caramel to your cocktails, which in the right cocktails works really, really, really well. So the first syrup that you're gonna need is Demerara syrup. Next up is Grenadine. Now, a lot of people don't know this. Grenadine is not actually cherry flavored, it's pomegranate flavored, and it's actually really super easy to make. Speaking of which, here's my progression into BJ Reynolds. If any of these syrups seem too complicated for you to make at home, that's okay. BJ Reynolds actually makes most of them. Actually, except for the coconut, BJ Reynolds makes all of them. I happen to have 3 of them on hand. I have the BJ Reynolds Grenadine, the BJ Reynolds Orjot, and the BJ Reynolds Passionfruit Syrup. So you see me use those in my cocktails a lot. But Grenadine is actually super easy to make. Simply just basically taking unsweetened Palm Wonderful and adding sugar to it, dissolving it. Now, that does bring up another question. Andy, how do I make these syrups? Well, I'm not gonna go into details on how to make each and every single one of these syrups. However, what I am gonna do at the end of this is talk about a little bit about how I make my syrups and talk about the differences between a 1-to-1 syrup and a 2-to-1 syrup. Next up, we have a classic Tiki syrup that shows up in the Mai Tai, Orjot. So as I mentioned, Orjot shows up in Mai Tais, it shows up in Scorpion Bowls, it shows up in Fog Cutters, shows up in a actually slew of classic Tiki cocktails. And this is essentially an almond syrup made from almond milk. Again, super easy, and I actually did make a video on a super simple way to make Orjot, how I make it, and I'll leave a link up here and in the description below. Next up, I'm gonna go into kind of a tart syrup, Passionfruit Syrup. Now, as you know, it was in the Saturn, it's also in the Cobra's Fang, kind of, but it is, again, super easy to make, and it does show up actually in a lot of classic Tiki cocktails. Actually, outside of Demerara Syrup and Grenadine, it is the 3rd highest used Tiki syrup. Go figure. Next up, we're gonna move into actually a one that's not used a ton, and that is cinnamon syrup. But it is used in 2 very, very well-known and very, very requested Tiki cocktails, and that is the Zombie and the Jet Pilot. So that's why I included it in this 7. You're actually not gonna find a ton of classic Tiki cocktails that call for this syrup, but if you wanna make a Zombie or a Jet Pilot, you're gonna need this. So I definitely think it's essential in your starting arsenal. Next up, we move into a different type of sweetener, and that is going to be honey syrup. Honey syrup actually was kind of a creation of Don the Beachcomber. And for a long time, the Tiki archaeologists, such as Beach Bum Berry, didn't understand how Don would use honey in his cocktails. Because if you just add a glob of honey to your shaking tin, it kind of congeals. And then when you add ice, it congeals even more. They actually discovered that if you cut it with water, that it actually becomes much more usable in cocktails. Now, there's a bunch of different ways to do this. You can make a 1-to-1 honey syrup. You can make a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 honey syrup. I actually prefer my honey syrups to be a 2-to-1. Now, that's my choice. You choose your own. If you want a more intense honey flavor, definitely go 3-to-1. If you want to thin it out a little bit more because the honey flavor you find dominates a lot of things, go 1-to-1. But mine, 2-to-1. One more syrup to go. And last but not least, we have our coconut syrup, also known as cream of coconut. Not coconut cream, because that is technically different. Now, why do I call mine coconut syrup and not cream of coconut? Well, because it's easier, to be honest. It's just about it. Now, I make my own coconut syrup, although I am working on a brand new recipe, and if that's something that you would like to see, drop a comment below. Once I finalize it, I'll shoot a video on it. But the kind of industry standard is Coco Lopez. So if you don't want to make your own, go grab a can of Coco Lopez. BJ Reynolds does not make a coconut syrup because it is super easy to get in the form of Coco Lopez. So these are the 7 essential syrups that I think you need when starting your own home Tiki bar. Now, as I mentioned, I'm not gonna go into how to make any of these syrups because that would just make for a really long video. Instead, I'm gonna give some pointers as to how about going to make these syrups. Some of my syrups I make 1-to-1, some of my syrups I make 2-to-1. It depends on the syrup, right? My honey syrup is a 2-to-1, my Demerara is typically a 2-to-1. The rest of my syrups are typically a 1-to-1 ratio. That means it is 1 part juice or liquid to 1 part sugar. My 2-to-1s are 2 part sugar to 1 part liquid. So let's take Demerara, for instance. My Demerara is a 2-to-1, so I use twice the amount of sugar as I do water. I dissolve it, there you go. For those of you at home that don't make a ton of cocktails for yourself, I always recommend making 2-to-1 syrups. 2-to-1 syrups are essentially shelf stable. The amount of sugar in it basically kills any bacteria. I happen to go through these things a lot because I make a lot of tiki cocktails for this channel. So I make 1-to-1 because it's much more cost effective for me. With that in mind, if you are going to make 2-to-1 syrups, do it. I highly recommend it. I also recommend doing smaller batches. A lot of recipes that you're going to find online call for yield 32 ounces. You're never going to use that in a sustainable amount of time. I make all of my syrups in 8-ounce batches. It's actually really easy. And then I have these nice little bottles that are about 8 ounces, and I just pour them into these, and they pour really, really nicely when I go to actually make a cocktail. Now, as far as the actual making process of the cocktails, a lot of recipes that you're gonna find include heat, and they are what are known as hot processed syrups. You're gonna put them in a pan over the stove, heat them up till the sugar dissolves. I'm actually a fan of cold processed syrups. And if you watch that Orjot video that I did earlier, you're gonna see what that looks like. But essentially, instead of using heat, we're using energy from blending to dissolve the sugar. So essentially, instead of putting it into a pan on the stove, I'm putting all my ingredients into a blender cup and blending it that way. I find that I get more consistent syrups that way. When you make a hot processed syrup, there's evaporation as you're heating the liquid, which is difficult to account for. So by doing a cold processed syrup, I know that all of my syrups are real, actual, either 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. If you want to get fancy and you have one, I actually highly recommend a sous vide. It's not something that I have, but it is something that I'm looking at buying. If you have any recommendations, please let me know on a good sous vide. But essentially, it's like hot processed without evaporation. It's pretty much the best option possible. And my last and final tip is no matter what you're doing, no matter it's a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 hot or cold processed syrup, always, always, always sanitize your bottles before putting your syrups in there. They will last much longer that way as well. Well, that's it for today's video, guys. I really hope you enjoyed it. We're going over the 7 essential syrups that you need to start your home tiki bar. I showed you how to make a Saturn, well, at least my version of it. Yeah, if you like this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel, click that little notification bell. Follow me over on Instagram and TikTok at Easy Tiki Drinks. I actually have a video up on my Patreon on how to make a super simple, fast cinnamon syrup where it doesn't take you 12 hours to make it, and it's way more intensely flavored actually, to be honest. So if you want to see how I make that, go check that out on Patreon. I'll leave a link in the description below. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and until next time, guys, you know the deal. Take it easy.